Hello and welcome to the Times Higher Education webinar, Transforming the Way the World Learns, How Educators Can Facilitate Inclusive and Accessible Learning, held in partnership with Teach-Well. My name is Srithu. I'm the Deputy Editor for Branded Content at THE. Before we begin, I would like to say that this webinar is being recorded. We will share an on-demand video and a summary article with all the participants after the webinar. We'll also be taking questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A function to post any questions you would like to ask the panel. I'm pleased to welcome Rob Telfer, Teach-Well's Director of Higher Education for EMEA, to our webinar. Rob will now tell us a little more about the importance of creating accessible learning environments and also introduce the panel of experts joining us for today's webinar. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Srithu. So let me extend a very warm welcome to our global audience of watchers and listeners. As Srithu says, my name's Rob. I'll be the host for today. Today, I am joined by one of my absolute favourite D2L colleagues, Dr. Sam Chandrasekhar, as well as two wonderful colleagues from academia. We've got Emma O'Neill from University College Dublin, and we've got Joe Elliott from Queen Mary University of London, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves fully in just a couple of minutes. As Srithu says, please drop in any questions that you have in the Q&A facility. I would estimate that we'll probably spend about 40 minutes in conversation, so that should, in theory, leave us ample time to address any questions. Also nice if you could put in the chat where you're actually joining us from. Always nice to see the sort of reach that these webinars have, so that would be cool if you could do that. So let's get into it. So the topic that we are going to dive into today, it's all about accessibility and inclusion. So I think that we'll focus on accessibility broadly speaking, but much of the discussion will probably veer into the sort of realm of equity inclusion through the prism of sort of the digital domain. Certainly from my perspective, the awareness around mobility and sensory impairments, mental health issues, specific learning differences, as well as things like medical conditions, which may impact day-to-day activities, has arguably never been greater. However, there's clearly still a lot of work to be done, and things like technology, infrastructure, systems design, policy, and of course, committed accessibility champions, such as our guests today, all have a significant role to play in ensuring that we do not unfairly disadvantage any of our learners. I guess the only other final thing that I would add is that we're very aware that there are different norms, there are different forms related to naming conventions around accessibility in different geographies. So please do always assume good intentions as we discuss this topic today. So at this stage, it's my pleasure to sort of turn it over to our guests so they can introduce themselves, their institutions. Emma, let's start with you, if that's okay. Could you introduce yourself and perhaps you could share what accessibility means to you?
Thanks, Rob. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon if I see we've got people attending from all over the world. So my name's Emma O'Neill. I'm Associate Professor in Small Animal Medicine here in University College Dublin. And Rob's asked me what accessibility means to me. I'd say very simply, I think it means striving to create a learning environment where every student is supported and enabled to thrive and achieve their full potential. So I'd keep it as simple as that, but very powerful.
Thank you, Emma. That's awesome. Could we go to Joe now?
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Elliott. I'm leader in learning design in the Digital Education Studio, which is based in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at Queen Mary University of London. And for me, like Emma, I think that accessibility and inclusivity is creating that space for all students to achieve whatever success means to them. And I think particularly when we're thinking about digital education, which of course is the space I work in, it becomes even more important from my perspective to make sure that learning environments are accessible and inclusive, because students don't necessarily have the same opportunities to easily reach out to staff casually to find out things as they go. We need to make sure that's all available for them in the environment. So I think that's a hugely important thing for us to do.
Thank you, Joe. And last but not least, Dr. Sam.
Thank you, Rob. Hello, I'm Sam Chandrasekhar. And as the Global Accessibility Lead at D2L, my focus is on aligning products and services with the diverse needs of our customers, such that every user, regardless of their abilities, is supported and enabled in performing their role as a learner, as an instructor, leader, or even staff. And inclusive pedagogy, specifically universal design for learning, is close to my heart because prior to joining D2L, I taught for several years in a Master of Design program in inclusive design at OCAD University in Toronto. So looking through that inclusive design lens, I believe accessibility is about choices. It's about recognizing that as human beings, we are all different and we have diverse needs. It's about focusing on enabling equity rather than equality, where equity is about giving each person what they need to set them up for success. It's about enhancing access. And here's where accessibility is about choices, because that's the means to make access happen. So in a nutshell, to me, accessibility, especially in the context of learning technology, is about providing choices to help learners consume content in multiple formats, engage in learning in multiple ways, and demonstrate their knowledge and skills in multiple forms. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you all. Brilliant. Let's get into the meat of the matter, as we say. So I think the first question that I want to pose to you guys is, who's typically responsible for promoting and ensuring accessibility in our classrooms? Sam, could we go to you first for that one?
I would like to say who I think should be responsible, because I'm directly not in a higher education setting, but I have a strong view that I believe accessibility should be viewed as a leadership imperative, regardless of people who are actually doing it. Because while there's usually a bottom-up effort to advocate for and to practice accessibility, leadership must create the policies, the plans, the procedures to enable people thrive in that practice. They must create a governance framework that ensures the establishment of an inclusive culture and support for all stakeholders who manage the technology, who create content, who deliver learning, and who ensure compliance. Also nurture community. There's a lot there. So if leaders don't take care, then there could be burnout. So that's where I would like to leave this.
Yeah, understood. Emma, Joe, any other things that you would contribute to that?
I guess I totally agree with Sam, but the other thing that I think that's really important to engender is an environment where everybody is expected to take a shared responsibility, because it can't be top down, it can't just be bottom up. I think everybody needs to be thinking about this and thinking what role they can play. I think Joe probably wants to talk a bit more about how people can be enabled in that, but I'm very much of the opinion that everybody needs to think it's their responsibility.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we need both that top-down and bottom-up approach. I think in practice, what we often end up with is a bit of a patchwork approach, where there's kind of the baseline of things that are, meeting accessibility standards and doing what's needed, and then there's people who are really going above and beyond. So I think we need to create that space for people to be able to try new things and do something based on what a student has told them would be good, what they've heard from something else somewhere else, and be able to share that out, influence other people's practice. But we also need to have that leadership view so that we have proper resourcing and systems in place. Because when we think about our academic staff, any staff who are involved in teaching and supported students, there's so many demands on people's time that often that little bit extra is reliant on people's goodwill or the knowledge of how to do that. So we need to have those systems, that resourcing in place, improving having time set aside and dedicated for this, so that people are able to make sure that they're learning accessible.
Okay, thanks, guys. So I think we're probably all pretty much broadly in agreement that it needs to be a leadership imperative, but that pretty much everyone in the education ecosystem needs to take some sort of responsibility for ensuring that their practice is accessible. I think obviously we know each other. I think that we're all broadly in agreement that accessibility and inclusion really ought to be a more of a priority in higher education. But I'm curious, and I think that our audience would be curious as well as to learn from your knowledge. What do you perceive to be the biggest challenges in ensuring equitable access for learners within our universities, colleges, and schools? Joe, do you want to go to that one first?
That's a big question. I don't think there's anyone who's going to argue against the importance of accessibility. I think everyone is aware that it is important and needing to be focused on. But I think the difficulty is the awareness of how actually to go about it. The awareness of what that actually looks like. I think everyone knows that we need transcripts, we need captions, we need to have a range of versions of things. But in terms of thinking about how do we create space for students to bring their whole selves to the learning experience, or how to meet the needs of neurodivergent students, for example, some of those more specific things I think are not so obvious to people. So I think the challenge is finding time to explore the different options, explore the different challenges, look at what's available, and I think that's where peer sharing really comes in.
Thank you, Joe. I'm sure that both Sam and Emma will have thoughts on this one too. Emma, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Rob. I think awareness is improving, which is fantastic, but there's always room for improvement. And I guess some of the people we need to bring along with us are those that are maybe not so readily thinking about it. So think of ways of reaching out to people, increasing awareness by doing it in a way that actually makes them stop and embrace and engage. And one thing that actually really spoke to me was David Rose, who is faculty at Harvard in education, actually used a fantastic example where he's a neuropsychologist, and he developed, he was one of the co-founders of CAS that are involved in developing a UDL framework. But he refers to himself and his wife, he talks about his wife Ruth, who's got perfect pitch, and talks about how she readily performs in concerts. She's fantastic, but actually in the environment of the local church, which has an out of tune organ, she can barely sing at all. And whereas the people in the church think he's a fantastic singer, and he'd refer to himself as really verging on challenged in a high performance environment. And that to me really spoke to me about viewing the environment as a really important determinant of how somebody actually performs, for want of a better word, thinking that performance is very much defined by the setting that you're performing in. And that to me really made it actually much more stark how we make judgment without even realizing, because we expect people to conform to the norms that we impose. And that, I think, using that sort of message that everyone can relate to is a way of really bringing more colleagues along with us. I work in a clinical setting, and we get so focused on how we do things that sometimes I don't think we stop to think, well, there might be other ways, there might be different ways that people could do things. And putting out messages that are accessible to people like that in terms of their understanding, I think can bring more people along with us. We've shared that on our Padlet as an example, if anyone wants to have a look at that in more detail.
A thought-provoking analogy there. Thanks for sharing. Sam, do you want to come in that one too?
Yeah, and yes, Emma, CAST, recently they completed 40 years. What a wonderful victory for UDL. And it's really remarkable that the US Senate passed a motion and they recognized CAST thanks to David's effort. And Joe, I agree with you that finding time is the biggest challenge, although I would say finding time to ensure that there is support and resources for content. That's the biggest challenge for me, because I've been a faculty member and passionate about accessibility and inclusion. And I know the pains of not having the time to make content accessible, even though I know how to do it, because this leads to frustration and burnout. Here's where technology helps, and it's helping better and better day by day. I would say the challenge, again, I'm going back to leaders, the challenge is not so much for the instructors, but as for the leaders, because they have to identify and procure the right technologies that can support the instructors and relieve their burden so that they can focus their energies on more creative endeavors. Both learners and instructors, I would say, can have more focused teaching and learning experience. So that's where I'd like to leave that.
Some great insights there, guys. Just for the benefit of the audience there, I think it was Emma mentioned a Padlet. So we have actually created a Padlet. We will share the link to that Padlet at the end of the webinar. There's some really great resources in that Padlet that you can all benefit from. But I think, yeah, just picking up on some of the conversation there, obviously there's some significant challenges around accessibility within our classrooms, but there's also some examples of great practice within higher education as well, which we can all collectively learn from. And I think on that note, I'm really interested to hear from Emma and Joe specifically, because, you know, Emma and Joe both work for really globally renowned universities. So I'm curious if there are any specific accessibility initiatives that either you guys have worked on or that you're aware of that have happened at your respective institutions that would be sort of worth sharing with the audience. Joe, maybe we could go to you first for that one.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you to people who flagged the audio issue. I have turned my microphone up, so hopefully you can hear me more clearly now. If not, let me know and I will resort back to the headset. I think one of the most impactful initiatives I was involved with for me was actually at a previous institution at Deakin University in Australia. And it was an initiative where staff and students were paired up, where the students acted as mentors for staff, talking about accessibility and inclusivity. And so we were able to meet with students several times throughout the year and talk to them about their experiences, their recommendations and ideas for creating more accessible and inclusive learning environments. And for me, it was just incredibly impactful because I was paired with a student who had an acquired brain injury, and they shared that on most days, it didn't really impact their ability to study and learn, but on the days it did, it was a really big impact. And so they needed things to be in place, and particularly they talked about the importance of live captioning in live online classes, because they talked about how when that wasn't used, they basically had to make a choice between going to the class live and benefiting from all the other students being there, that ability to talk to them, and the watching the recording that had the transcription, because they were able to process the information they were hearing much better when they could read it as well. So through that conversation, we were able to start a campaign across the university about the importance of that live captioning, talk to staff about how to enable that within their classes so that students didn't have to request it. And I just thought that was such a wonderful initiative, that pairing up of staff and students so that we could have those safe conversations where staff could share about what they they weren't sure about, and students could talk about their own experiences. So that one was really.
Yeah, that's a lovely example, actually. Your audio is coming in and out a little bit, Joe, but that's a fantastic example from Deakin University in Australia. So thank you for sharing. Emma, perhaps you could come in that one too.
Thanks, Rob. I just wanted to share the experience of being part of the UDL badging initiative that's gone on in Ireland. I've experienced this just as one of the facilitators, but this is a programme that's been rolled out in Ireland looking to enhance people's awareness of the CAST UDL framework. So what they did was created an easy to complete badging approach to UDL, where people were asked to reflect on the diversity of their students, think about the UDL and learn about the UDL framework, think about how that could be used to support diverse learners. And then something that I thought was really fantastic is using a +1 approach, which was really along the lines of, it's so easy to get really blown away by how massive the task is, but if you break it down into achievable goals and just think about something that you could do that would make your +1 difference, and then people were invited to do their own +1 in their own setting, where they approach redesign of one element of what they did, designed with an awareness guided by UDL principles. So to put some figures on that, there are now over 4,000 educators have completed this badge across Ireland, including over 500 at UCD, University College Dublin, where I work. And I think, and 36 of us act as facilitators to then drive the process forwards. But I think it's really fantastic how much you can increase awareness by taking an approach like this and sort of expanding out so that each facilitator can then teach more, well, facilitate more people in this learning and fan it out from there. So that's the experience I wanted to share.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thanks for sharing. That's quite a marvelous impact there. I want to, so Sam was talking about technology, obviously, a few minutes ago, and I think maybe I just want to veer into the technology space a little bit with this question, but yeah, a little bit of background. I've always been fascinated by technology. No great surprise, I've worked in technology for more than 2 decades, but when I was an undergraduate studying at the University of Aberdeen, there was no such thing as a virtual learning environment or a learning management system or a virtual classroom or any of that stuff. They simply hadn't been invented yet. And this is quite a broad question, but I think what I would like to do is probably ask, how have the emergence of these technologies, which are now ubiquitous in our higher education classrooms, how have they impacted accessibility in education? Sam, perhaps we could go to you for that one first.
Sure, Rob, I can share my thoughts. So I've heard it said that a technology makes things easy for many, but for some, it makes it possible. A number of you must have heard this, but it's very poignant because it ensures that some people can learn, because education is a fundamental human right. And I do believe that the role technology plays is significant, and I'm happy to be a part of that. What also comes to my mind is from listening to Joe and Emma in their last spiel, the variability across time of disabilities. When we design technology, we need to keep in mind all those things: variability across time and the intersectionality. There's no binary in disabilities. So when we design technology, it's important to keep the human in focus and remember the variability, intersectionality, and all those other attributes, so that everyone can participate, regardless of the disabilities. Access, participate, create, contribute, and thrive as a community. I believe all of this is required, and education and technology can definitely impact in every one of these spheres. That's what I believe.
Thank you, Sam. Well considered answers there. Emma, do you want to take that one on?
Thanks. Thanks, Rob. I think technology offers huge opportunities. It offers a way of interacting with students in lots of different ways. So it does really lend itself to thinking about how you can use the UDL approach to multiple means of representation, action and expression, and also engagement. But always, like all things, there's no magic bullet. You have to think about the affordances technology has to offer, but actually link those very carefully to what the learning requirements are. So I think sometimes technology can get bad press because we expect it to do everything, but it's like all things, you have to think how you're wanting to use it. So I would argue that it's like Pandora's box, but we have to be careful how we open it and careful how we use it. But the other thing that I've looked at that I'm really interested in is how much you could have the opportunity to influence learners outside normal class time as well. And that's something that I've looked at, trying to help use it to support metacognitive skills in students, that you can be, I always think of it being a nice analogy, thinking about Jiminy Cricket on Pinocchio's shoulder, that some of our students don't find that they naturally think about how they learn or learn in an effective way. But if you can offer little prompts and guides, as Jiminy Cricket did, to bring them back to the way that might help them learn, might question them, how they're learning, question where they are in their learning, that we can support in lots of different ways. So that's using the technology, but using it in a way that really is tailored to how it might help students.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks for mentioning Jiminy Cricket, taking me back to my youth. Jo, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I do. Third time lucky on the audio. How are we going?
Audio's good.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, I would agree with Emma that although technology can do a lot to facilitate accessibility, it isn't a silver bullet, and we need to think about those design aspects and carefully think about who we are including, what we're designing for, and as we bring in new technologies or new initiatives, who we might be excluding through not thinking about it. But I think some of the really important technologies for me are things that we can use either in fully online learning or in classrooms, things like Mentimeter or Padlet, lots of polling tools that allow large groups of students to share, be heard, and also create spaces that students can ask questions or put forward ideas without necessarily needing to put their name to them, which I think can be very important, creating that safe space for students to ask questions without having to maybe worry about feeling like they're being a little bit silly putting their hand up in class. Because I mean, as much as we can tell students there's no silly questions, it's important to ask. It is hard to put your hand up in any classroom, whether it's an online one, whether it's in a large lecture theatre. And I think particularly as we're looking at more hybrid means of education, where you might have some online students being beamed into a classroom and don't necessarily see who they're talking to, that can be even scarier to start speaking out, and you don't know who you're talking to, you don't know how big your face is on screen or how loud your voice is, whether you can be heard. So creating those other ways for students to participate, and also to have that time to maybe frame their question, frame their comment, and think about how they're going to phrase that, get their ideas across, because not all of us come across as overly articulate the first time we open our mouths.
Thank you for sharing that one. And obviously you're touching on sort of the online aspect of learning these days. There are so many more students. There's more students now learning either fully online or as part of a blended offering than there has been in history. And touching on sort of accommodating different needs within those environments is important. There's some significant instructional design experience on this call as well, and I'm just curious if you guys have any sort of additional thoughts as to, you know, what are the main considerations to make sure that we don't exclude any learner when we're building out a fully online or a partially online course. Who wants to take that one on? Let's go to Sam. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yes, I do, but I would like to leave what actually goes on in the field in terms of building out the courses. For example, offering content in, like the instructor creating content in multiple formats, or creating assignments in such a way that students can engage, can demonstrate their knowledge in multiple ways. When instructors make all that effort, my point is that the learning platform that they use must offer features that support that universal design, the learning design for learning efforts. So to make it clearer, I'm saying that it's not just enough for instructors to build out a fully online or blended course in an equitable, accessible way. There should also be technology that allows the instructor to upload that content in multiple formats, or the learner to upload their assignments in multiple formats, or even provide the instructors and the learners multiple ways to engage in the teaching and learning. So that's where I come from.
A lot of food for thought there. Joe, anything on that one?
Yeah, I would certainly agree about the importance of choice, and giving students options for different ways to engage, represent what they can do. But I think it's also really important to ask students as well, and create that space for getting students involved in that learning design process, whether it's beforehand, if we can consult with students or draw on feedback, bring students in part of a kind of co-creation process for learning materials for programs, but then also having ways throughout term and as courses are running, as classes are running, for students to be able to make suggestions, to point things out, and not just waiting for students to raise things, but actually proactively seeking that feedback, asking students, what do you need? What would make it easier for you to fully participate in this learning experience? Because as we've talked about, there's so many different needs and preferences from a learning environment and learning experience. We can try and cover most of those, and as Sam's talked about, UDL is a really good way of trying to capture most of those, but there's going to be individual needs and preferences as well. And the best way to find out about those is simply to ask, in my experience.
I'm going to jump in, Rob. I'm not waiting for you, because when I designed and taught a course on accessibility and inclusive design at the U of T, University of Toronto, in 2020, this is exactly what I did. Sent out a survey. There were 70 students online. It was COVID time. And a survey at the initial stages to ask, like, what are your preferences? What are your needs? And then keep that Google Doc open throughout the term and keep noting if there's some changes going on. And then it's interesting that we went to EDUCAUSE, the student who helped me as an assistant, and myself, we went to EDUCAUSE conference and did a presentation about inclusively designing an inclusive design course. That was interesting. So focusing on what the learner needs is absolutely important. Otherwise, why are we delivering? Right, yeah. Thank you.
Great points. Looking at the clock now, as usual, running out of time. I'm gonna move it on. I'm thinking about again, thinking about this sort of dynamic where we've got so many online courses now, so fully online cohorts sometimes. And I talk to teachers, educators pretty much every day of my life, and a lot of them naturally worry about how do you sort of encourage collaboration, connection. How do you encourage students to form authentic connections with one another when they're learning online? Do you guys have any sort of tips on how to foster community in that type of environment?
I think it's a tricky balance to get, because I think we need to think about the reasons that online students tend to study online, which is that they need that flexibility. They can't necessarily commit to being in a particular place at a particular time. So having that asynchronous way of connecting is really important. But I think, again, it comes down to providing lots of choice and providing the opportunities for students to connect with each other. Not all students are going to want to take advantage of those or take advantage of all of them. But I think if we can provide a range of ways for students to connect, starting out with some simple icebreaker activities. I've done some using Padlet with students posting introductions to themselves and trying to form those connections, find those points of similarity and shared interests before the learning experience really kicks off. So they know who they're learning with, they've got the beginnings of a relationship there. And then having a mix of things like collaborative activities using Padlet, shared documents, etc. Discussion activities where they can be reflecting on what something means in their particular context, and really encouraging them to engage with each other in those discussions. I know that discussion forums can be a bit of a source of angst for teachers and students alike, but I think if we design them carefully, make it very clear what the expectations of the discussion are, what the discussion is focused on. I think if it's too open-ended, it can be hard for students to know where to even begin. But if there's a very clear purpose, clear topic that they're being asked to discuss, I think that works really well. And it's talking to students about what the benefits of those connections, that social learning is, that it's not just that we want to check that they're logging into the module site and that they're there. We're not checking up on them. It is an opportunity for them to get feedback on their ideas, to learn from other people, to connect with other people. I think having that explicit conversation about the benefits and the intentions of some of the learning activities we do goes a really long way to getting students engaged with those and understanding why we ask them to do particular things.
I think I jump in and say there, Jo, I totally agree with the but why. I'm a bit of a but why person, but I think everybody is, because you always will engage with something more if you understand why. So I've been involved in designing and running an online learning program for vets and practice, and trying to build that community of inquiry approach. I have to resort to the dreaded discussion boards, because you need to have the students learn as if they feel like there is that social presence and people out there, that they're not just learning in a vacuum, but they're not always that keen to involve themselves in the discussion board. So gradually building it and explaining why and getting them to provide peer feedback. I do quite a bit of reflective practice with them, and that also comes back to the trying to understand what helps students and what hinders students. And it's interesting, they do talk about how they didn't like it at the beginning and they didn't understand, but once they started to see the value of it and understand the whys, then they came along with it far more. So I think it's something we sometimes forget to do. We can try and walk in each other's shoes, and we can try and think about that as much as possible, but we're never very good at imagining each other's shoes if we don't stop and ask people, well, how am I doing walking in your shoes, and making it open for that conversation. So I think that's something I try and keep reminding myself.
Great points there. Okay, we're running down the clock a little bit here. I want to go to Sam for a question, and this really concerns your role at D2L. So obviously you work for a sort of technology company that is a global one, and I'm curious about how you, in your role, think about accessibility during the sort of product development life cycle. as Brightspace is being continuously developed, and how do you go about ensuring that accessibility is kept top of mind during that process?
So first off, I'm proud to say that in D2L, as a company, we have a human-centered organizational culture in everything that we do, and that reflects automatically in our approach towards building products and services. So what we do is to adopt a learner-centered approach. And we practice inclusive design, obviously, because I brought that into D2L. We use the IDEA framework: inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility. And we involve people with disabilities at every stage of the product development cycle. We do that through a partnership with a company called Fable. And our belief is that technology is a bridge. That's what we try to make as a product, a bridge or a connection across all the humans involved in teaching and learning. So instructor to learner, or across all learners as a community. And our responsibility also extends beyond reaching that technology to our customers, but continuously being with them so that every time there's a barrier experienced, we are there to resolve that barrier and help instructors and learners with disabilities continue their teaching and learning. So that's the philosophy and the practice that we follow in product development in D2L.
Lovely, love the idea of the technology as a bridge. Let me go to a sort of broader question again. Thinking about sort of collective awareness of accessibility and inclusion, what do you guys see as being tips to increase awareness of accessibility and inclusion going forward? Emma, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think telling stories is always a way. You want to try and find an in to get somebody to understand why, and that's where I thought that story with the David Rose story worked. It was something everyone could relate to, and everybody does like stories. We've met a few times to chat before this webinar, and all of us agreed that if we're told lots of information, we don't always remember it. I do a very good impression of a goldfish, but if somebody tells me a story, then I'm much more likely to remember it. I might not remember all the ins and outs of it, but I get the gist of it. So I think that's something that we can do, is give somebody a story that they can relate to, that they can then think about how it might translate into their own setting. I think Sam also had a really nice analogy. Maybe Sam, you could say about the time you met the group of people that were visually impaired, and they suddenly talked about how the table was changed for you when it went dark.
Okay, I mean, I'll try to make it as short as possible, Emma, because I totally agree on stories. And it was a time maybe 15, 18 years ago when I went to Vienna for the ICCHP conference as a volunteer. I was visiting a blind friend who had a blind partner, and their blind friend came and took me around Vienna to sightsee. Came back in the evening, it's getting darker. I'm unable to see what's in front of me. I'm asking them, excuse me, where's the light switch? And they go, light switch? What's that? And they were going about their jobs very comfortably. That's when I realized, oh, I'm so photon dependent. And at that point, I realized it's all about majority, right? And minority. I was the minority there, and it was a norm to not have lights. Like Haben Girma, this is another story, Emma, from CSUN. Haben Girma mentioned in the keynote that the light in the room is an accommodation for people who can see, and the chairs in the room are for people who don't use wheelchairs. They're all accommodations costing millions of dollars, which we don't blink an eye about, but we care a lot to spend $2 to accommodate people who are minority in our world.
But I think as soon as we bring stories like that into discussion, then it makes people more likely to relate and think about applying it again in another setting. I think that's far more likely to make people stop and think than actually just a big list of we should do this or we should think about this.
I think the other thing that's important to share is practice and examples, because it's much easier to start doing something or get ideas about how you can resolve an issue or a challenge for somebody when you've seen how someone else has done it. So the more I think we can showcase the really cool things that some people are doing and make it clearer to students how, or to any staff, how they can pick those up, how they can use those in their practice, and also sharing information about the easy things that are available, the things that are built in. Will all have accessibility checkers within many of the tools we use day to day. The Microsoft Accessibility Checker, the one that's built into our institutional VLE, will all have them. So making use of those, making people aware that they're there, but then also making it clear what the next steps might be and how they can take it a step further.
I thought the +1 approach with that, exactly as Joe suggested, examples is really powerful, but the cascade effect of the +1 was why I think that worked really well in our environment here, because people could see, well, look, one small thing, I can do that. Somebody else did that. I can bring that to my own practice, and they can see, well, look, even one small thing can make a big impact. Because I think we're all guilty of being disabled by thinking we can't do something because the task is so massive. So if we make it possible for ourselves by breaking it down into small pieces, much as we think about doing if we were designing something for our learners, that in itself can be really empowering.
Yeah, great points, everyone. I think teaching it forward is so important. That there was a bit of a recurring theme in that conversation. I'm got my eye on the chat now with various questions coming in, and I think one thing we might want to touch on here is it's around the theme of, it's come up a couple of times. Is there any sort of quick wins? Is there any practical advice or strategies that you can offer the audience as they progress their own accessibility initiatives?
I would strongly recommend every single person in the audience, if they do not have lived experience, but themselves or in the family or in their friend circle, to go and seek out one person with a disability. There's 1.3 billion of us there, to actually spend time to share spaces and experience the constraints. The difference that makes is phenomenal.
Brilliant. Any other ideas on that one, guys?
I think make use of what is available, those built-in checkers, the resources within your institution as well. Going back to Emma's stories, I when designing a program once, I thought I'd done quite a good job with getting the accessibility right. I'd gone through, I'd applied all the correct heading structured. I'd make sure there were alternatives, transcripts, captions. I'd followed all the guidelines. And then I asked a colleague from our Disability Resource Centre to review it for me using a screen reader. And I could have cried at what his experience was like. So I think, yeah, talk to people and talk to the experts in this at your institution. See if someone can have a look at your sites, going above and beyond what the accessibility checkers might look at, and talk to other people, see what other people are doing as well, and just make it a norm to have that conversation with people, whether it's your colleagues, whether it's your students, about accessibility and inclusivity and how we can make it easier for everybody.
Brilliant. More questions in the chat. I'm just scanning for the good ones. How can institutions integrate continuous professional development to educators to help educators address the evolving challenges of digitization in higher education. How do we formalize that sort of CPD element? Any thoughts on that one, guys?
Looking at how we approach accessibility maturity in D2L, I would say conduct a survey or in any other way, find out the learning gap. It's called the learning gap analysis. And then based on that, create tiered structure of knowledge dissemination. It could be culture at the bottom, and then about technologies and disabilities, and then about content creation, about delivery, so that, and then deliver them repeatedly across the year. Make it like a program. And of course, it depends exclusively on the needs of the institution. It cannot be one may not suit another institution. So each one has to develop their own.
Yeah, perfect.
I think that's where leadership comes in as well. We need to have the senior leadership championing these efforts as well, and creating that space and the time for people to engage with the accessibility and inclusivity CPD, because otherwise it does end up dropping down the priority list for many people. It shouldn't, but it is a reality that we can only engage in so much CPD, and if there's no recognition and championing of that, and there's no time and space for people to engage with it, unfortunately it's likely to become a tick box exercise, and that's the opposite of what we want to see.
Yeah, agree. Okay, a question from Shauna McCusker. So this is kind of UK centric, but maybe you guys might have any thoughts on this. Are there any institutions? In fact, I'll add to that question. So the question is, are there any institutions in the UK that are doing this work very well that we could look to as a shining example? I would probably add, are there any institutions or people? Are there any sort of thought leaders or experts that you would point towards as really being a shining light in this space?
One of the examples I've shared on the Padlet, and apologies, I have seen the comment about the slight downsides of Padlet, so I do apologize for that oversight. But I've shared the blog of Maha Bali, who is, she's at the American University in Cairo, and does some amazing work in inclusive education and intentionally equitable education. And I think she's doing some amazing stuff and showcasing some incredible colleagues as well. So I think definitely shining a light on her work there.
Yeah, and Maha Bali is also very active in Equity Unbound, which is an amazing resource for community, creating community and nurturing community. So she's definitely a person to follow.
And also shameless plug for our very own Dr. Sam Chandrasekhar, who's a shining light in the field. So please do follow Sam. She wouldn't say that herself, so I'll say that on her behalf.
I would just say at D2L, we have an accessibility academy where we've created a number of courses. I've added it to the Padlet. I didn't know how to make an account, so it says anonymous. Apologies for that, but you can go there and access those courses. And Emma's metacognition course is also listed there, so don't miss that.
Thanks, Sam.
I'm gonna maybe ask one more question and then I'm gonna wrap it up. So this is an interesting one, and it could be somewhat controversial. And actually, Maha Bali that we were just talking about has some ideas on this. But the question from Kate Courage is, do you see Gen AI tools as an opportunity for greater inclusivity in education? And I would maybe just add to that as well, Gen AI, but are things like augmented reality and virtual reality and any of these emerging technologies, you know, what are going to be the impact? Is it completely unknown, or does anyone have any thoughts on that?
So as somebody who's the vice chairperson of Canada's AI Accessible and Equitable AI Standards Committee, and I'm also on the One EdTech Task Force for GenAI rubric, data rubric. I would say that, like any other technology, there's the plus and the minus, and there's a lot that GenAI can do to improve accessibility and inclusion in education, so long as we are aware of the equity issues and the accessibility issues and the privacy issues and manage those. It is something educators must adopt. Change our ways of thinking and doing. It's disruptive, but it's a welcome change. There's lots of resources we could share maybe later in the Padlets. We were thinking we're avoiding that word intentionally, but it came up, so we spoke to it.
I knew it would come up. Any other thoughts on that in about 1 minute from Joe or Emma?
I think it's hugely complex, and we could have another hour talking about the pros and cons of Gen AI. Like Sam, I think there are some real opportunities there, but I think there's it's really complex. There's lots we need to think about, lots of bias, equity, ethical issues around that. And I think it needs to be an ongoing conversation, both between ourselves as educators, but also with our students to equip them for the world in which they are living and working.
Agree. Okay, I think
I'm going to add just very briefly, if I could. I think we need to teach our students and work with our students on using AI, because it's going to be so mainstay. I think sometimes we tend to, what I see with quite a few staff is maybe they react against and say we mustn't let them use it. But if we're trying to support students in becoming future participants in society, then that's what they're going to be interacting with all the time. But even more, this is where we need to learn with them, because they probably, some of them will be ahead of us on the learning curve. And this is an example of that Joe spoke to, of working with students as we look at how we interact with these. This would be where we can probably learn from them and admit that we don't know as much as we need to, and we're going to have to learn quickly to keep up with using these technologies and seeing how they impact and which groups they impact more than others. So asking questions and learning with students.
Agree. It's a brave new world. Okay, look, I'm going to close the show now. So look to our panel of experts, Sam, Emma, and Joe. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your time with us today. It's really appreciated. Also, thank you to everyone who came to watch and listen from all over the world. Hopefully you enjoyed the conversation and that there were some meaningful kind of takeaways there for you. Shameless plug, we also hope that you will join us for an upcoming product tour, which will be happening on July the 17th. That'll be a D2L webinar. We'll take you through the Brightspace Learning Management Platform and demonstrate some of the latest developments we've been working on at D2L to make online learning more accessible and inclusive to learners everywhere. We alluded to the fact there's a Padlet, so that does have a range of resources. It will contain blogs, information about UDL from CAST, as well as sort of handy tips and tricks, things like that. Our partners at Times Higher Education as well, they will be sending out a post-event summary of the webinar and also a link to an on-demand video recording. So yeah, just again, thank you for your attention and participation today. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the time we have today. I would like to thank all our panelists for this insightful and interesting conversation. Thank you also to our participants for joining us today and contributing to the discussion. As Rob mentioned, we will share a recording of this webinar and a post-event summary article with all the registered participants in the coming days. Thank you once again, and goodbye.